Okay, thanks so much. I think we can now start. Thank you, everyone, for joining in. I know it's a bit early for participants, but thank you so much for being considerate and joining in sometime early. And I would also like to really thank our speakers, Cecilia, Mo, and Subi, for joining. I hope, Subi, I'm pronouncing your name in the right way. Thanks so much also for joining us. It's a great pleasure to have you today. And today we'll get to hear about, how do we choose our careers? How do we choose how do we do good with what we hope to pursue in the future, that is in our work areas? And we'll be hearing from Cecilia Mwansubi, who are part of an organization called Effective Altruism. I came to learn about Effective Altruism, I think, earlier this year, and that was through Cecilia. I've known Cecilia for quite some time now. I think almost close to 2 years or 3 years, Cecilia. Yeah, and before she used to work a lot in AMR before she transitioned. And Cecilia really did a lot of work. Previously, she also worked at FAR, and she was really instrumental in terms of advocating for early career professionals and tertiary level students, giving them spaces and giving them the platforms. And then she transitioned into Effective Altruism. I think I was actually intrigued. So I read about a lot about the organization and what they do, and they really do a lot of great work. And I believe that they will be sharing with us today, and hopefully we can learn more. So thank you so much. I'll hand it over to you, Cecilia, Mo, and Subi. Maybe you can introduce yourself and we can start off. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I will briefly jump into what the concept of effective altruism is first, and then we will do a round of presentations of us as speakers with that in mind. But yes, effective altruism, we usually call it more like a project or a movement rather than an organization, because there are many organizations in the world that are somehow connected to effective altruism. But if we say that it is a project, we would say like it's an intellectual and practical project that is focused on answering a question, and that is, how can we best help others? So the intellectual part of this is to try to use evidence and reason and scientific methods to figure out like what are the most promising things to work on, and also like if we have something we want to work on, like what are the most promising approaches to actually making a difference. And the practical part is that we shouldn't just think about these things, we should also try to do it. So if we have figured out something really promising, we should also use our time and our resources to actually do something about it. And what's really important to understand here is that effective altruism can look like a lot of different things, like the different answers people find to these questions can vary a lot. So therefore, like we wanted to take this as our introduction to the three of us, because we live in different countries, different parts of the world, and have used effective altruism in different ways. So maybe Surbhi, you would like to start with introducing yourself.
Yeah, sure. Hi all, I'm Surbhi. I am originally from India. I grew up in Delhi and I came to the US for college. Academically, my background was in development economics. So just thinking about what are ways that we can help countries grow faster, improve their various social systems. And in college, I was very much focused on research and trying to go down the academic pathway. At some point, I encountered effective altruism in college and realized that my skill set actually lay more in the operational side. So instead of doing research, I switched into roles where I was doing more actually like running programs, doing things on the ground. And after college, I ended up working in management consulting to do some of the career capital, skill building, and learning the best practices from the corporate sector, and transitioned back into nonprofit about a year ago. So now I work for Give Directly, which is a nonprofit that does unconditional cash transfers for people living in extreme poverty. We mostly work in East Africa right now. And over the last year, I've spent a lot of time in Malawi, where we've been implementing a big cash transfer program there. Cool. Mo?
Thanks. Hi, everybody. I'm Mo. I come from Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. That's where I was born and raised. I went to college in the US, studying physics, actually. And then I came back to Malaysia and worked doing data analysis and then a little bit of project management in various industries and various departments. And late last year, I decided to make a switch from my career, feeling that I had done enough career capital building and skill building, so to speak, and wanting to make a difference with my skills. And so I applied for and managed to get a grant to support my career exploration. And I'm exploring a number of different paths, from improving representation of EAs and LMICs to improving the state of measurement and estimation of altruistic value, to ensure that altruistic projects within EA actually deliver value. So that's my background. On to you, Cecilia.
Yeah, and yeah, I grew up in Sweden, and I studied environmental engineering. And before I got involved with effective altruism, what I was working on then was a startup that was working on a new type of solar cells. So I was basically working on like sustainable energy solutions. And what I changed after being in touch with, like, from the ideas of effective altruism, is that I turned more to working on how we can improve the value that comes from scientific research. So before, I was basically working with a startup that was trying to use the results of research, and I switched to trying to rather make the research system produce more value. So one thing was this past job where I met Daniel. Then I was working with grant making in the AMR space, where I tried to both just learn a lot more about how the research system worked to be able to do good things later, but also to improve how grants were made, because there were some things where I could see that, like, there seemed to be like very promising programs that still have very hard time getting funding. So I was hoping to make some difference there as well. So these are just some examples of how we have used effective altruism. And the question here is then, like, what do we actually need effective altruism, or we use the abbreviation EA for? Because a lot of people try to do good things and have nothing to do with effective altruism. But the thing that I think is specific to effective altruism is that we recognize that it's, even if you try to do good, it's easy to fail. Like, a lot of attempts to do good actually fail. And also that it can be hard to recognize what is actually working or not. And thirdly, that these opportunities to do good can be very unevenly distributed. So it can be not just that it can be hard to know what works or what doesn't work, but between two different things that both work, the difference can be huge in how well they work. So this, like, saying this like just abstractly doesn't give very much, maybe. So we will go into an example that is based on the research of Esther Duflo and Abhijit Banerjee. Maybe you recognize those names because they actually got a Nobel Prize in 2019 for their work on the differences between different interventions. And we will look at a specific study that they worked on that was about different interventions trying to get children to attend school more. And in this study, they actually were looking and comparing 58 different interventions that have been studied in 28 different countries, and we'll not go over all of those. We'll go through just 5 of those. And we'll do this as a quiz. So I will now present 5 different interventions for you. And I would want you to think about, while I'm presenting it, which one of those do you think is more effective? And here we're talking cost effective. So it's both like they should work well in getting the kids to attend school more, but also they should work well compared to how much they cost. So you could basically think like if we were to spend $1,000 on one of these programs, which one do you think you would achieve most with for this given amount? And I'll let you vote in the chat afterwards, like what do you think? So don't jump out first, like listen to all 5, and then you'll get to vote on which you believe most in. So the first program was in Nepal, where they had observed that it seemed like girls would not attend school as much when they had their periods. So they did a program where they were basically just distributing sanitary products for girls and menstrual protection for girls, which is also pretty cheap, of course. And the idea was that this would make it easier for these girls to attend school. The second program was in Malawi, and this was conditional cash transfers. So they were giving cash to the families of girls who attended school. They were giving out cash, and like you got the cash only if the daughter of the family or the daughters were attending school. And then we had a third program in Ghana. This was a bit similar. It was also about giving money to students, but this was targeted towards kids who were from low-income families. And in Ghana, the tuition fees can be quite high. So it was basically a scholarship that should cover the tuition fees for poor families. And then we have the fourth one. This was in Kenya, and in a place where even though school uniforms are not compulsory, there's like a very strong social pressure that you should have a school uniform. And what they did in this program was basically just giving out school uniforms for free so that nobody would stay home because they didn't have a school uniform. And then the fifth and final one is in Afghanistan, where they were building village schools. And the background here is that for a lot of kids, it's a long way to go to school and it can be quite dangerous. So therefore they thought, like, if we build schools closer to where people live, then maybe it will be easier for them to attend school. So here you see an overview. We have the menstrual cups for girls, the money for girls attending schools in Malawi. We have the scholarships for those in need in Ghana. And then we have free school uniforms in Kenya. And then we have the village schools in Afghanistan. So now you can just think about these and write in the chat, what is your guess of what works best when also considering the cost of the intervention? Have somebody here the scholarship in Ghana? Scholarships, somebody more? Being student that attends schools, that would be the Malawi one, I think. For girls to attend schools. It's funny to see the cultural difference here. I think like when I have done this for university students in Sweden, everybody believes that it's the menstrual cups for girls that is the highest. So I think it's interesting to see the difference also in how people guess. Village schools, somebody here, and somebody for the sanitary cups. Awesome. I think you have gotten enough time to guess now, so I will just move on. So the result, as you can see, is that village schools was like a lot better than the other interventions here. And menstrual cups for girls, that was actually one intervention where they did not see any impact like on months of schooling. It was a quite popular intervention. People liked it, but it did not make the girls attend school more. And I think it's noteworthy here, like on this, like that the differences are so big that it actually looks like the different scholarships and money for girls attending school, like these look almost the same. But actually, like the difference is almost like 100% here. It's just that they are all dwarfed by the village schools intervention. And now these were only 5 of the interventions that were in this whole study. But we can, if we look at the one that was most effective, that was an intervention with deworming at scale. So these pills that you can take to get rid of intestinal worms, because kids who have that get very malnutrition. It causes malnutrition and pain and fatigue that makes it very hard to go to school, and it's very cheap to solve. So what we can see here is that it's a huge difference between different interventions. And even if we would look at completely different area, like for example, if you want to combat AMR, like you would of course want to identify like what is the deworming in AMR, so you don't end up spending your entire career working at something that doesn't matter, because it was really difficult like beforehand to just guess like which one of those would work. And this is just like from this paper, like an overview of all the different interventions that or intervention types. There were also other that were promising with vitamin supplements, for example, in India. And this was one study, or like one meta study, but there's also other research that points in the same direction. So this is, for example, research from the World Bank, where they are looking at different interventions to fighting HIV or AIDS, and where they also see this, that while most of the different interventions have pretty low cost effectiveness, you have a few that are just exceptional in comparison. And there is other research here from University of Exeter that looks at also the same thing, and how people generally underestimate the difference between different charities and different interventions. So the takeaway from what we've seen so far, that's basically, I would say, just that we shouldn't just trust our intuition. We shouldn't just guess or take the first thing that we think of if we want to do the most good that we can with our lives and our careers. But it doesn't really tell us what we should do instead, because if you think about like, what should I do with my career, it's not likely that you'll find a published paper that has like a comparison of all your alternatives and then somebody figured out what's best. So we need something else. Like for some areas there is research done, but for a lot of areas there is no studies done where you can see exactly what is the best thing. So therefore, in effective altruism, there is a tool that is used a lot that's often called a prioritization framework. That is that you look at 3 different factors, and that is scale, solvability, and neglectedness. And scale, that is if we look at a specific problem and try to evaluate it, we look at how big it is. And or you can turn it around and say, like, if we solve this problem, how good would it be? So, for example, for a problem like climate change, if we solved climate change, that would be hugely good, because there is so much suffering that would be not happening if we solve that. While if we solved, trying to think of something trivial, like if we solved that my house has ugly windows, that's not a big problem and nobody really cares if we solve that. If we look at the next part of the framework, we have solvability, or sometimes it's called tractability. That is, it can also be formulated like, if we double the resources that's dedicated to this problem, what fraction of the problem would we expect to solve? Or like, how easy is it to actually make progress here? So we can again look at, if we try to solve climate change, it might actually be really difficult to know what we should be doing. It's not straightforward how to solve it, compared to, again, like fixing the windows on my house. Like that's a pretty easy thing. And both of those matter, because there can be things also that are big problems. Like I wouldn't say climate change is so difficult that we shouldn't try to solve it, of course, but you can see if you compare different opportunities, there might be the risk of a supernova, for example, that would threaten all life on Earth. It's very hard for us to do anything about it, even if the scale, of course, would be huge if that happened. And then finally, the third part of neglectedness, and that's looking at how much resources already go into solving this problem. And that is something that can sometimes be a bit counterintuitive, because if you think about problems that are neglected, or the problems that most easily come to mind to work on, it's often problems that other people are also working on. And it can be harder to come up with those that are more neglected. But it can also be the case, for example, for me, that I've switched from working on green energy to improving the science system. It's not necessarily that I think that it's a more important problem in itself, but I think it's like a lot more competent people are already trying to create sustainable energy than what are trying to improve the science system. And that can be a reason for me to work there, because I think it matters more to have one more person working on the science system than it matters having one more person working on green energy. And of course, this is just a tool to try to help reason. This tool will not tell you exactly like you should do this or you should do that, but it's a way to structure your problem solving. So I will give, before I give you a little bit time to react to this, I'll give you a couple of examples of areas that are often mentioned in effective altruism. So the first one is global poverty and health. And here the scale is really big, of course. We have almost 700 million living in extreme poverty. And neglect, here you can reason around it. It depends a bit on what you compare it to. Of course, there are a lot of good people working, trying to solve this problem, but you could also compare like the resources spent on this compared to resources spent on more trivial things, and think like we should really increase the resources here. And then we have solvability, and this is where this area scores really high. Like a lot of the problems in this area could be solved with just money or with really simple interventions. And an example here of an organization is Against Malaria Foundation that distributes bed nets to prevent malaria. But I could also mention here the organization that Surbhi works for that is distributing money to people living in extreme poverty. And that's, of course, a very simple intervention, but there are also like a lot of studies that show that this is actually a really, really effective way of working with this problem. Another area that's also discussed a lot in effective altruism is animal welfare. And here, if we look at the framework, we have the scale. I had to Google this just before because I don't know this number by heart, but it's apparently over 75 billion farmed land animals that are slaughtered each year and over 1 trillion fish. So, and a lot of these animals are also kept in quite horrible conditions. So if you think about like the amount of suffering here, it's a lot. And even if this doesn't depend on that you would think that the suffering of animals would be valued the same as the suffering of humans, for example. Like even if you think we should not care about it as much, but if we should just care a little, it's still like such a huge amount of animals that we should probably care about this problem. And the neglectedness here is also huge. Like if we look at donations, for example, to charities to try to solve this, it's just a tiny, tiny fraction of all the donations that are made. And it's a lot of people, of course, who also don't really care about this problem in comparison to other problems. Solvability here, I always find a bit tricky because on one hand, it's a very easy problem to solve. Like technically, it would be very feasible to just stop having a lot of animal agriculture or stop eating a lot of animal products. But if we look at how the real world actually works, that would mean that we had to come to huge changes in policy and culture and so on. So I would also say here that solvability is pretty tricky in that sense here. And one organization working here is the Humane League that tries to reduce animal suffering in different ways. And then the third area that I also want to mention here is long-termism. And this is something that is pretty big in effective altruism discussions, but not so much outside of effective altruism. So I think it's good to mention it. And that is to work on improving the long-term future of humanity. And here we often talk about, not the next 10 or 50 years, but rather like what will the world look like in 1,000 years or longer than that. And here the scale is enormous. It's like all the future generations that we could possibly have if we don't go extinct. The neglect it also scores high, if you say so, on neglectedness, because it's very few people who work on trying to improve the long-term future. But the problem with this area is, of course, solvability. It could be really hard to figure out what we can do today to improve the future of humanity in 1,000 years from now. It's hard to predict like what consequences our actions today will have for that future. There are some people working on it. So there is, for example, the Future of Humanity Institute at Oxford that are focused on this kind of work. And something that is important to just mention here, I think, is that there are very different sources of information here. Against Malaria Foundation, and a lot of global health work that's based on evidence and the kind of studies that we looked at before, where you have actually done an intervention, you have done it in the random control trial way, where you can quite definitely say, like, does this work or not? And how well does it work? If we're talking about like the long-term future, or even if we're just talking about trying to do good work in an area like AMR, it's often the case that there is no evidence, and it's like extremely hard to get evidence, or impossible even. And then when we are not able to produce this kind of robust evidence, then we can work instead with reason and like try the best we can to figure out what is the most effective thing to do. But it's also good to understand, because sometimes it can be that people get the perception that effective altruism is only about solving simple problems where you can do random control trials, and that's not at all the case. It's trying to answer the questions like with the best methods that we have available. So a quick little break from just me talking here. Do you have any thoughts so far, or any questions like on the framework or about the cause areas? You can write in the chat as well. I have it up on my screen if there's. Maybe everything is just very clear. There will be chance for questions in the end as well. So, but then oh, Daniel, yes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Cecilia. I just wanted to ask a question. I think the approach is really great. The scale, solvability, and neglect. And my question was just at the beginning, where we had 5 case studies that were looking at the different interventions that can help improve school uptake of education. And I noticed that there was kind of the data was kind of heterogeneous in that it was looking at different contexts, that is different countries, and also the age group that was being addressed was quite different. Yeah. So I just wanted to ask how does it, comparing the different interventions, given that they really don't come from a standard approach, does it give us really credible evidence on what works best and what doesn't work?
I think that's a great question. And that's also, of course, the limitation with these random control trials. They tell us what worked in this context. But it's, of course, the value of it is if you're able to transfer it and then say, what are we going to do in a different place? I think here, if you would, I can also leave a link to the actual study. I'll do that in the chat now immediately, because they reason around. Oh, sorry, I'll do it later when I'm not speaking, because this got confusing. But what they reason around, for example, is this with conditional cash transfers, like that very similar interventions have been done in a lot of different contexts. And then you can start to believe that, okay, probably if this has worked in these 10 different places, then it's kind of likely that it will work in another place as well. But of course, if we have just tried it out in one place in a very specific context, then it's much harder to know if it will work in another one. Surbhi, I don't know if you have something to add here, given the context of Give Directly, because you have done studies in different areas, I believe.
Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, I think exactly what you said. Like, I think some of these interventions, they seem like simple at face value, especially with cash transfers that we do, but the context can vary a lot. So for example, at GD, we've noticed that there are significant variations in the impact based on who we're targeting in our program. So we do unconditional cash. That is like no strings attached. You're welcome to spend it as you want. But if we're targeting, say, refugees versus targeting female populations, younger, like student age populations, and so on, that can have like very different long run effects because of the dynamics at play. Yeah. So it's one of those annoying answers that's always like, it depends.
I managed to get the link now also. So I put that in the chat where you, if you're interested in the specific study, you can read up more on it. It's quite interesting. Oops. There is the point where I should hand over to Mo. And Mo, you just tell me like when you want me to shift in the presentation.
Of course. Thank you so much, Cecilia. By the way, Daniel, maybe if I can add one last thing to what Cecilia and Surbhi mentioned. What you pointed out regarding the heterogeneity of the data, to me, one takeaway from looking at variation in cost effectiveness in different contexts is caution when we want to roll out the same program in different contexts. We can't just say based on looking at promising results in a single very specific context that, oh, it's definitely going to work in all the other contexts. Therefore, we should push on this very, very hard. So caution is always, I think, a good thing to keep in mind with regards to interventions. Now, to say a bit more about this, so here's a number. You guys may be wondering, what is this number? This is an estimate of the number of hours you would probably work in your entire career. So if you work, for example, about 8 hours a day, 5 days a week, that's 40 hours a week. If you work about 50 weeks in a year, that's about 40 times 50, that's 2,000 hours. And if you work over a period of about 40 years in your entire career, that's 80,000 hours. And the point to make here is that if you want to think about all the things that you can do to do the most good in your life, career choice is probably the biggest ethical decision, probably by far for most people. This is something that is not usually thought of in those terms. People usually think about career choice in terms of life satisfaction, or in terms of if maybe helping other people, not necessarily in a maximizing context, but it's a useful reference frame to keep in mind that if we are really serious about trying to do as much good as possible, then probably the biggest single ethical decision is choosing careers. And given that we spend probably 80,000 hours in our career, it's worth thinking very hard about which careers you want to choose. So Cecilia, can you move to the next slide? And now we can start to think about how careers can vary in terms of impact. So there are a lot of ways you can factor impact. One way to think about it is to use this framework of comparing, for example, problems by scale and neglectedness. In practice, the variation is something along the order of 100-fold. And within the same problem, comparing solutions and recognizing that solution effectiveness can range again between 10 to 100-fold. And even given a problem and an intervention, finding a path with more or less leverage, there can also be huge variation there. Examples of leverage include everything from mobilizing other people to spreading ideas via tools that let you reach more people. You can think of leverage in a multiplier context. And finally, finding work that fits you better. This is actually very important, and you might overlook this if you obsess too much on the impact part of the equation and you think I should deny myself personal fit, then you might go down the wrong path. Personal fit matters as well, but it's also not the only thing you should consider. So it's important to recognize that these figures stack multiplicatively. So that's why you get variation in impact when you do make career decisions that can range up to millions fold, which is why it's worth spending quite some time to pick the right career choice. One way to think about it is even if you spend, let's say, 800 hours thinking about what career you should choose to maximize impact, then that's still only about 1% of the entire time you can spend on your career. So you can think of 1% of your time spent thinking about career options as yielding huge impact compared to if you didn't think about career options at all. So it's very, very useful to just stop and think. This is it's also kind of a useful thing to keep in mind, because for a lot of people, and I'm guessing this might include you as well, you might want to act now. You're thinking, there's a lot of these pressing problems. I'm not doing anything about it. There's this urgency. I need to do something about it now. And the thing about that is that if you act immediately, you might miss out on huge potential opportunities. So it's very much worth just stopping for a while, even a few hundred hours, which if I say a few hundred hours, it feels like a very, very long period of time. It's actually very, very short in the scheme of how much time you spend working over the course of your entire life. So that's one way to think about it. So can we go to the next slide? We have a lot of different organizations within EA globally, working on many different problems, and also just doing a lot of different things. Everything from mentorship, which is what OneBAM does, to animal welfare, which is what Good Food Institute does, to cash transfers, which is what Directly does. This is also a way of reiterating the fact that there are many ways to do good that are very, very impactful. There are a lot of organizations that are already doing it. So you don't have to think that, oh, just because we are trying to do the most good possible, there's one single answer to doing good. No, that's not the case. Again, think of effective altruism not as a set of answers to a question, but as a question itself. The question is, how do we do the most good? Different people have different answers based on personal fit, and this leads to different organizations working on different problems. So can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, and I'll pass this to Surbhi. Thanks.
Cool, thank you for that overview. Yeah, so as Mo said, your career choice is an ethical decision, and there is a wide amount of variability and potential paths that you could take. I remember encountering this when I first got into EA 5-6 years ago, and being like, okay, this is all great, but my peers who are in American countries, different places have a very different option set than the one I was looking at, because the Indian education system is very different. The career paths I had available to me were very different, which led to some amount of disillusionment at various points in my sort of own search for my career path. But I think over time, I came to realize that one of the biggest sort of blind spots for EA as a movement right now is that for a movement that's trying to do most good for the world, it is still like very overrepresented and focused on richer countries and so on. So Mo and I, we worked on a project where we were trying to devise sort of what it might look like for people from low and middle income countries to take more part in EA and actually move the movement into a place that is more representative of the world itself. And you all, as this group, are actually like uniquely positioned to make that impact as people from LMICs. So you have extremely high potential and skill, as is already evidenced by the fact that you're here and like engaging in this webinar and doing these courses. You already have a high desire to create positive impact, and you already have a high contextual knowledge about your country and society simply by virtue of having grown up there, studied there, and yeah, knowing how the systems operate in your environment. And why this is important is because there's the entire scale, solvability, and neglectedness part of finding a cause, but as Mo said, there's also a personal fit part of it. And those two combined is what leads to your sort of personal equation of the most impact you can have. And I think, again, as people from LMICs, some of the most impact we could have is sort of bridging the information asymmetries in global EA. So bringing to the fore more problems that people from other countries maybe are not seeing, or potential solutions to those problems, or even how can we operate and implement solutions in various environments that might be harder for someone from another cultural context to do. So for this, we actually prepared a career guide for people from LMICs, which offers some more tactical guidance. Step one of that guidance is usually, as Mo said, just focus on yourself and learn as much as you can about various potential paths available to you and do self-reflection, building career capital, building the skill set required to actually start making impact in those paths. And if you think that you're already slightly further along in that journey, there are many potential ways you could apply your skills, right? So one could be working at more global EA organizations, such as the one Mo talked about in the previous page, or maybe starting an organization in your own country, or working at an existing organization, even if it doesn't openly identify as EA, to improve the ability for them to be more evidence-driven, more impactful, more effective, which could be create as much good in the world as potentially working directly for an EA org. We can go to the next page. And yeah, these are just some, we can share the slides with you later so you have the links, but these are just some very like 101 resources that I'd recommend checking out. On the top right, you have the career guide itself. That might be a good sort of first port of call since it compiles links to a number of other resources. And then I'd also recommend Magnify Mentoring if you're part of a woman or gender minority, and virtual programs. Virtual programs are actually extremely exciting. Like every month, they're three month long programs where you get paired with a group of 4 or 5 people from around the world and do EA readings together. And it's both a great environment to like learn more about EA, but also meet people from literally all over the world. So I've done 2 or 3 of these, and we've had people from, I think, every continent pretty much, except Antarctica on every single one of our cohorts. Cool, I'll pause there. I think we have plenty of time for questions. So if any of this spurred, further questions, happy to share more about our own journeys or anything else.
While we're waiting for questions, I just want to add that actually the mentorship program, they have opened for everyone. So it's not just for women and non-binary now. But also I will stop screen sharing while waiting for questions, and then I can immediately post these links in the chat as well. But please ask questions either by the microphone or just in the chat as well.
Thanks so much, Cecilia, Surbhi, and Mo. I think for still processing, it's kind of it's a novel topic. And this will also bring me to directing my question just as we prepare, because I think I have seen about the work of effective altruism. However, I don't think the movement has been able to kind of penetrate Africa so much. So I just wanted to ask maybe what are the ongoing any plans or any ongoing projects to kind of penetrate and share these concepts within the African continent, and areas that maybe some of the interested participants, if they would love to also join in, maybe also establish small satellite, maybe movements within their respective countries. Yeah, thank you.
Surbhi, do you know best to answer this question, maybe?
So yeah, no, you're absolutely right. I think that's one of, again, biggest blind spots for EA right now, is that there hasn't been as much community building as we'd like in lower and middle income countries yet. I will say that's slowly starting to change. So for example, earlier this year, there was an EA conference in Mexico City and another one in India. And hopefully, I'm sure there are plans to expand into Africa as well. To start off, as just like a starting resource, I will say that the global resources are actually pretty accessible since most of them are online. So that might be a really good like first step starting point. And as you sort of spend more time talking to people in the space, I'm sure both there'll be opportunities for you to start university chapters, local city chapters, and also connect with other community builders on the continent. I don't know if you have different experience in Southeast Asia, Mo.
So just to add very quickly to what Surbhi said, maybe one small thing you can do is to just, if you live in, let's say, Nigeria, you can Google EA Nigeria and see whether it exists. Because that's actually something that I did a few years ago, because I didn't know that a local chapter of EA existed in Malaysia. And just by Googling EA Malaysia, I discovered the local chapter, and that's how I met the community for the first time, despite having read the ideas beforehand. So that's just something that we can do.
Searching for Facebook groups can be really good also, to search for effective altruism plus your location in Facebook.
Thank you so much for the response. I can see we have Iradat as a question.
Okay. Good day, everyone. Am I audible? Am I audible?
Yes, yes, you're audible.
Okay, thank you. My question is, when you talk about a problem, or you talked about maybe if you have to focus on a particular problem, you have to maybe focus. You can also focus on problems that are existing, but does not have as a lesser focus, where like people don't really focus on that problem. So my issue is maybe in Africa or in Nigeria, where I'm from, where maybe you want to start, you want to actually have interest in alternative protein, and over here you have people not really wanting that because they feel, because they like more, they are more of animal proteins. So how do you think you can like maybe start an organization or start a movement to advocate for this thing, so that you have people buying into this and see it as a problem? Because they might not really see it as a problem, that maybe due to climate change, they might not see it as a problem that needs to be solved as climate change issue. So how do you think you can go about this?
Is anyone grabbing this question? I think this is actually a bit a classical issue with this neglectedness, that neglectedness can stand against tractability. That if something is extremely neglected, and also like this can be like locally in your country, for example, or your context, then it can be so neglected that it's not solvable right there where you are. It can also be the case that it's not possible for you from your position to work on it. I had this experience some years back when I had ideas for a huge project to change how academia worked. And then I realized very quickly that if you want to change academia, then you need to have seniors on board who have credibility, because nobody will care about what somebody who doesn't even have a PhD says. So I think this is really that you need to take the different things in account, but say that you're in a position where you can choose between two problems that you think are equally difficult for you to contribute to, and they are equally important, but then one of them is much more neglected. So one of them, there are 1,000 people working on it, but one is 10 people. Then I think this can be a guide to go towards the one with 10 people. Another way to think about it is like, how replaceable would you be? So a classical example here is that a doctor in Sweden, for example, a doctor in Sweden might save a lot of lives if you look at like the patients he treats, but that doctor is replaceable. So if that person would not be a doctor, there would be another doctor doing the same job. While if you take something, if that same person would go and work as an activist with animal welfare, for example, that might mean that there is one more activist working on animal welfare, and that there weren't so many to start with. So yeah, it's a little bit complex, but yeah, I think you're very right to identify, like, it's not always that the more neglected, the more promising an area is.
See a question in the chat as well. I can read it out and take a stab at addressing it. So Pius asked, I happen to be indecisive when it comes to setting on decisions. I'd like to find out, when it comes to settling on a career choice, are there other additional things you'd recommend as guiding steps aside from the EA framework, especially for someone like me who is indecisive? So this is actually a point I had meant to address, but forgot to. But another facet of your career, given it's 80,000 hours long, is that it's very long, and you can take an iterative approach to deciding what's best for you. So for all of us, we've had like different stints in different fields, and as we've gathered more information and maybe our like priors have updated as new causes have come up, as new technologies have come up, we have sort of like veered around, taken some decisions to like move between fields and so on, to find what is the best fit, highest impact fit for us at that point in time. So I think one thing to think about when you're sort of just daunted by decision making is that no decision is like fully permanent. So whatever you do, as long as you're getting information out of it, if it's either a really good experience or a really bad experience, I would still say it's a positive experience, because if it's bad, you know you don't want to do that anymore. And if it's good, you know you can continue going down that path. So yeah, definitely just like iteration, don't think that any decision's permanent, and just keep seeking out information over time.
And just to add on a bit to what Surbhi said, during your iteration of your career options, one thing to keep in mind is look for skills that are transferable to different contexts, to different jobs. For example, operations management, or just management in general, HR, accounting. Just a lot of the what you might call conventional skills that help organizations run better, transferable across a lot of different contexts, and EA is no different. So worst comes to worst, just focus on learning transferable skills so that you become useful across a lot of different contexts. That's one part of building career capital.
Daniel, I thought you had your hand up earlier, sorry.
Yes, sorry. So I just wanted to ask a question as we go on about solvability, and I'll take this from my local context. I find that in some areas we have problems that are very dire, and they are there because they are kind of very complex and challenging to solve. But you also realize that the problems actually impact people negatively so much. So they actually, in a way, need to be solved. And I just want to inquire, and I think this discourages people from going into such paths, because it's very difficult to maybe solve such issues as compared to doing other things which are, yes, easily solvable, or maybe there's some background to it, or there's some baseline. So just want to ask, how then do we, what is the thin line between creating that inspiration, or helping people focus on a problem, even when it seems so complex, having that motivation to focus on that particular problem, in the face that you have very few people who are working on that problem, but it's really urgent, or it's really something that needs to be addressed. So maybe you can also share a bit on that. Thank you.
I have one thought to start off with here, and that's actually that this really ties to why I like that there is a community around effective altruism that is a bit of a social community as well, and not only as a research field or only professional. And that is that it's very daunting to take on a very difficult project if you're thinking only of yourself as an individual, because that means that if I try to do this and I fail, then I have failed and it didn't work and it was worthless. But if we do this together, so that we are like 1,000 people who try with solving difficult projects, like if we are really trying with difficult things, most of us will actually fail. But that's okay if some of us succeed, and we can't know beforehand. Like we can try to make good bets and we can try to have good approaches. But if we're trying to do really difficult things, it's predictable that a lot of us will fail with the things that we're doing. And therefore, I think it's so important to not just think of this as individuals, but to do it together as a community. And then we can, as a community together, like celebrate the wins and when somebody succeeds, but we can also recognize like people who do really good work, but it didn't work out, to still recognize them for their good work. And that like, it's not the individual achievement that matters, but it is that we together manage to improve the world. I think it's a challenge for anyone who wants to improve the world, this balance between like how difficult things can I do, because what if I don't succeed? But I think the community, for me personally, the community has helped a lot with this. So yeah. Mo and Surbhi, I don't know if you have any other.
Yeah, I think I'm aligned with that. I think just having a community of folks around you who are thinking about the same things can help with like feeling motivated and not isolated. Another thing that comes up for me, since we work on cash transfers right now, is that I think EA is sometimes criticized for focusing on the symptoms of problems, not their root causes. So global poverty, for example, cash transfer solves the symptom of global poverty, which is people being poor, but not the root cause, which is like institutional issues, lack of education systems, lack of healthcare systems. And for me, I almost feel like those two problems are interlinked, and the symptoms are just like more solvable, more tractable in the short term, but they inform how we're going to solve the structural issues. So that is what sort of keeps me motivated, that, oh, okay, I know that in the day-to-day we are running programs, we're trying to redistribute wealth around the world to the extent we can, while also on the side, like helping inform research on institutional issues, and sort of hopefully getting to a better equilibrium state on the like harder problem of institutional change.
Thank you so much, Cecilia and Surbhi. Yeah, I think we don't have any other question in the chat. Maybe guys, if you have any question, I think maybe if any other question comes up as we digest what has been shared today, I think maybe you can share, then I'll forward it to Cecilia, Surbhi, and most that we can address it. Otherwise, I think we are clocking the hour, and I know it's quite very late in Malaysia. So I just want to thank our speakers, Cecilia, Mo, and Surbhi, for really taking our time to educate us. And I hope that we have learned something, and we have just a framework that we can add on to help us prioritize what we decide to use with our 80 hours as we finish school. I'm sure some of us have already finished quite recently. And also, as we've been told, you really don't have to make a final decision. It's an iterative process, so you can always try this. And the good thing is that the more you experiment, the more you learn, and the more you are really capacitated in terms of the decision that you make. Yeah, and I hope being an AMR champion, most of us will kind of also see it as an issue. But the key thing is that we need to see how we use our careers into solving the problem. You really don't have to work in the AMR space, but there are maybe some systems issues that you can address that in the long run kind of help antimicrobial resistance and other healthcare challenges as a result. So thank you so much. And at this point, I'll hand it over to Cecilia, Mo, and Surbhi for final remarks. And I think we can call it a day. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you for asking us to speak today. I'm really, really excited to be able to introduce these concepts. And if it's people who have been listening who get interested in this, like check out the links that we shared and Google a bit, because there is we have really just scratched the surface a little bit here today. So if you're interested in this, there is so much material and yeah, so much more to find online. So I really encourage you to do that if you thought this was interesting. Thank you very much.
Just to quickly add, if you read our EA Career Guide for people from LMICs and you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us. We are more than happy to answer any questions, share any resources that you might have.
Yep, and thank you so much, Cecilia, for inviting us. And yeah, all of this seems extremely exciting, and thank you, Daniel, for organizing. So I wish you all the best with your explorations.
Thank you. Thanks so much. The good thing is that we have quite a diverse audience, so I'm sure that each one of us will try and contextualize the information depending on our local context. So thanks so much, everyone, and I wish us a wonderful evening ahead and wonderful night. Bye-bye.